Good afternoon. My name is Keith Curry, President, CEO of Compton College. I'm here today to serve as the MC and also to keep the program going. I'm very excited about today's virtual town hall. First, I'd like to thank the individuals who are part of making this happen. I'd like to thank the HMN Group, Emoja, the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges, the Campaign for College Opportunity, the Educational Trust West, the Community College League of California, and the California Community College Chancellor's Office, and also the California Legislative Black Caucus. I'd also like to say thank you for completing our poll to begin our webinar. Please make sure you use our hashtag Black Student Success for your Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, all over social media. We will be sending out a webinar evaluation in the next couple of days, but please make sure you complete that. What's also important too is related to the chat. Please make sure to type in your questions in the question and answer box. Those will be answered, and we also have a Q&A session towards the end of the presentations today. Please make sure when you have a question to use in the chat. You can start with example like who's the presenter, who's the question for. For example, it'd be Dr. Curry, question about Black student success at Compton College, and that's example. Right now, our students in California community colleges need us the most, particularly African American students. So today's conversation is important in light of COVID-19, but also is important as it relates to our success of our students moving forward for the next generation. It gives me great pleasure to begin introducing our first speakers today. First, I would like to introduce Senator Stephen Bradford, who is the Vice Chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus and also represents the 35th Senate District.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. How are you doing today? And I want to appreciate your leadership in convening this webinar. And I apologize for the technical difficulties that I can't see everyone's lovely face, but I'm here to represent not only the 35th Senate District, but as Vice Chair of the Legislative Black Caucus to share with you some of the things that we're working on in the legislature to address this pandemic, this crisis of great proportions in the African American community. It's often stated when America gets the cold, African Americans get the pneumonia. Well, it's clear today that when a pandemic hits the world, African Americans are dying at a far greater rate than any other population. It's also clear that through this pandemic, it has put great exposure on the great disparities that have existed throughout the beginning of this country as it relates to people of color. So these are not new when we talk about the educational disparities, the healthcare disparities, the food deserts that exist in our community, just you name it, job opportunities. All this pandemic is doing is shining a light. But it's our opportunity as many challenges present themselves to show our mantle and show what we're working made of to move forward. And that's why I'm excited about the Legislative Black Caucus. We just had a great discussion with Governor Newsom on Monday, and we highlighted many of our priorities, and education is one of them, as well as, like I say, healthcare. But more importantly, before we can address this problem, we have to first assemble the data. And that's what we're challenging the governor and even our federal government to get the data, because as it slowly trickles in, again, we're seeing those folks who were deemed low-income frontline employee service workers that people kind of like disregarded are now classified as essential workers. And who are those essential workers? They're Black and brown people. There are food servers. There are hotel cleaners and custodians. There are transportation operators. There are nurses, nurses' aides and nursing homes and things of that nature. It's the people that this college trains and prepares for the workforce. And it's clear that we need to make sure that as resources go forward, that they impact the communities that need it the most. Of that first wave of federal dollars, I can assure you, none of it went to Compton, Gardena, Carson, San Pedro, any of those areas that clearly needed it, where we saw major corporations like Ruth Chris and Shake Shack getting tens of millions of dollars, while small, struggling African American and Latino businesses are struggling to stay afloat. So it's going to be my challenge to make sure we direct those resources. And I'm excited that our Speaker Pro Tem appointed me and Senator Hertzberg to serve as co-chairs of the Economic Recovery Committee. So that's what we're going to be working on. And I just want to leave you with one thing. Go to covid19.ca.gov, covid19.ca.gov. If there's any questions, hopefully we can also help you facilitate and get answers to that website. So thank you, Dr. Curry.
Thank you, Senator Bradford. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Assemblymember Sidney Kamlager, Secretary of the California Legislative Black Caucus and also the 54th Assembly District Representative.
I am so honored to be part of this conversation. And as you know, I have much love for the Community College District. I spent years as the president of the Los Angeles Community College District on that board. And people don't know how much stuff goes down at the community colleges. I also, as you mentioned, am secretary for the California Legislative Black Caucus, and we have been working tirelessly through this pandemic to shine a light on the incredible disparities that African Americans face. This has really revealed the fragility of our public health system. It has revealed the fragility of our numerous economies that keep states and cities afloat. And it has also revealed the frailties of our education system. We know that as younger students in K through 12 are sheltering at home and are learning at home, well, what do you know? It has come to parents and everyone else's attention that our kids don't know how to write well. We've also learned that not many of our students have complete, consistent access to have wireless access or have the technology in their homes to allow them to practice distance learning in a way that makes sense and will prove successful to them. We know that our teachers are challenged with having that kind of technology and knowing how to use it in a way that works for our kids. And we are going to see a growing disparity in our achievement gap. And so when our young people graduate out of the K through 12 system and go into community colleges or into four-year universities, those systems are going to be stressed at a disproportionate rate because of the challenges that we are seeing bubble up as a result of COVID. We know that nearly 2/3 of Black high school graduates in California are ineligible for CSU or UC admissions because of a variety of reasons. And we need to make sure that as we're talking about what a post-COVID world looks like, that we are addressing the classisms and the racisms that are inherent in those disparities. We know that as a result of their inability to get into those systems, they turn to our community colleges because they have proven to be gateways into pursuing higher education and vocational training. I believe it's one of the best places and most affordable places for folks to start a college career. But I also know, because I saw these things in effect, that there are amazing challenges still faced by our community colleges. Over 40% of Black community college students are also parents and have childcare needs. Nearly 80% of Black students in community colleges are part-time workers. A huge percentage of our young people that are in community colleges come out of the foster care system or have been touched by the juvenile justice system and need additional supports. And so we have an obligation to talk about disparities, to talk about poverty. And now I think we will have an opportunity to talk about how we reimagine the educational experience in community colleges for our African American students. I am certainly looking to being a part of those conversations. Black Caucus has engaged with the Superintendent of Public Instruction. We have been talking with members that are on the committees for higher education about what our achievement gaps are going to look like and what we have to do to shore up this system in a way that works for our students.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Kamlager. We appreciate your support here today. Now it'll give me great pleasure to introduce Pamela Hayes, who is the Vice President of the California Community Colleges Board of Governors.
Thanks so much, Keith. I just want to start off by saying that I want to welcome, on behalf of my board, the Board of Governors, as well as the California Community Colleges Board of Trustees. This is a very important conversation, and it's a conversation on Black student success. My interest in this conversation is personal. As someone who attended her local community college oh so many years ago, the conversation we're about to engage in is critically necessary in this time and in this space, because we will be talking about a number of the issues that have already been spoken of by the Assemblywoman and the Senator. It's about the true cost of college, financial aid. It's about family responsibilities. It is about our students don't necessarily come directly out of high school, or if they have, many of them are returning after a few years out in the workforce. So it is extremely important, because these are the issues that tend to act as roadblocks to Black student success. But at the core of this conversation, we need to make certain that we're talking about equity, because that's what this is about. You'll be hearing from researchers, community leaders, policymakers, practitioners, and students who will be sharing research and data, not just conjecture and opinion. While we tend to talk about all students, today our focus will be on Black community college students, because the reality is race has always and continues to play a determinant role in the allocation of resources. And if we are uncertain about this statement, we can only right now look at the COVID-19 pandemic and the death rates among African Americans across this country. Race consciousness can and must be used proactively if we are to be intentional, if we are to focus and change our policies, practices, and institutional structures in ways that really change outcomes for our students. Because it's not only through the lens of income, housing, food insecurity, health, and family responsibility that have already been mentioned. This conversation must happen through the lens of race and how race intersects with these issues, that true reform and transformative change can be a reality. I want to thank the organizers, the partners we have, faculty members, and presenters for their commitment and their contributions to this important conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vice President Pam Hayes. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker to provide opening remarks. I would like to introduce Chancellor Eloy Ortiz Oakley for the California Community Colleges.
Thank you, President Curry, and thank you to everyone who's on this town hall. I can't think of a more important topic to be talking about right now than the amazing students of the California Community Colleges, and certainly the amazing Black and African American students that we serve and that we need to do a better job of serving. This is a critical time for our students. You all know this. And it was a challenge going into this crisis. This crisis has exacerbated the challenge to communities of color throughout California. And so this is a critical time for us to come together to continue to put a focus on the vision for success, which has equity at the center of that vision, has an emphasis on closing the equity gaps that exist. And there is no greater equity gap than the equity gap we see for our African American students. That's something that we should not have been tolerating before this crisis, and that's an issue that we need to ensure we don't tolerate during this crisis. We've already seen the impacts that this crisis is having on a public health point of view to the African American community, to the Latinx community, to communities of poverty throughout the country. So this is a major issue for the Chancellor's office, both in terms of the direct support for students of color, in terms of their basic needs, in terms of the advocacy that we provide, in terms of ensuring that we're implementing AB 705, ensuring that we're having equity at the center of everything we do, but also as it relates to what is happening to workers throughout California and the impact this economy is having on them. So many millions of Californians are out of work right now. And as you can imagine, the crisis is impacting particular communities even harder. So it's no surprise to anybody on this town hall who this affects the most and why it is so important for us to be in a position to serve communities of color and to directly lean into the challenges that our African American community faces. So I want to thank you all for this town hall. Thank you for the advocacy that you are committing to. We need that advocacy more than ever right now. The state of California has had a huge impact on its budget. The legislature, the governor are going to have to reprioritize funding. We have to make sure that the African American community is at the front of the line when it comes to the types of resources that we're going to need in our colleges to support those communities. So I hope that you join us at the Chancellor's office, join us with all of our equity partners throughout the state, and continue this advocacy. And then the last thing I'd say is, this is no time for us to take the foot off the gas. We were working hard on improving the diversity of our system, ensuring that we have more leaders of color in places of leadership throughout the system, ensuring that we have more faculty of color in our classrooms. We cannot hit the pause button on that initiative. We have to double down on our efforts to make sure that that happens. So I hope that you join us. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you for everything that you're doing to serve every community college student, and in particular, the work that you're doing to help us focus time and attention on the African American community in our colleges. So thank you, Keith, and your entire team for putting this on. I appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Chancellor Oakley. Your comments regards to double down is very important as we move forward post-COVID-19. And one of the things that we're excited about today is having remarks from the California Community College Black and African American Advisory Panel that's been doing work over last year to provide some recommendations as it relates to African American students. So it's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Ms. Cassandra Jennings, the President and CEO of the Greater Sacramento Urban League, and Greg Irish, Executive Director of the City of Los Angeles Workforce Development Board.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. I'm Greg Irish. I share in the responsibilities as the co-chair of the Black and African American Advisory Panel. The genesis of this was, of course, the Chancellor. Our charge, and I should first say the panel is comprised of leaders and influencers statewide from education, workforce development, business, and the faith communities. And our charge from the Chancellor is to identify obstacles and solutions to the barriers and the challenges to African American enrollment in community college. We're among the many efforts and endeavors being undertaken throughout the state by various stakeholders, including yours, regarding the issue of African American college enrollment. Quite frankly, we are a direct and critical source of expertise and intelligence for the controller. So he's welcomed all this input from throughout the state. Also, we're part of that. We're one of the other efforts, one of the other endeavors to advise the Chancellor, come up with some solutions to what the challenges are to African Americans enrolled in higher education. My colleague will go through some of the efforts, some of the different activities we've been engaged in over the past few months, including holding a series of town halls statewide to garner community input on these issues. I'll turn it over to her.
Yes, and thank you, Greg, and also glad to be here to share. So upon the 5 town hall meetings and many focus groups at the panel held throughout the state, the panel has prepared a major findings and recommendations that we've shared with a number of stakeholders throughout the state already, and we'll continue to share it. Next slide, please. And the major findings are listed on your slide. Let me say, first of all, students and parents are mostly unaware of many different programs and resources available to community colleges that could really help students succeed in college, especially financial aid. So these are the findings that we found. Secondly, Isolation is a negative factor on campus, especially on campuses where Black students make up only a small percentage of the overall student population. For Black students, the campus environment is often unfriendly and unwelcoming, with few role models represented in the staff, faculty, and you already heard in administration, with whom they could bond and turn to for advice or counsel. Thirdly, students and parents have no clear value of the career educational programs and the way that they're being prepared for and obtaining the good jobs that really could make a difference now and in the future. Now, the campus programs are differentiators in securing student success. So what we heard was students who participate in campus programs like Umoja, like A2Men and others, or have strong support systems, the report is that there's higher satisfaction and certainly greater success in their college experience. And I say, in spite of everything, optimism still runs high in the community. And so we want to make sure that outreach is early, often, and is essential. Next and final slide. And so the critical sort of 6 findings that led to our 6 recommendations is the panel is considered critical to changing the trajectory of Black and African-American students in the community colleges. So we must begin to target outreach and awareness activities with students in high school and ideally in middle school. This would ensure that students, parents, and the influencers are fully aware of the resources and opportunities available as early as possible. Secondly, we must engage and support existing on and off campus, the community leaders, the college educators and administrators, the support systems, programs, and organizations that cultivate an environment of inclusion, an environment of trust, and an environment for achievement for our students and parents. And then the advertising and the information and outreach, that needs to be clear and obviously targeted to African-American students and their parents, utilizing positive and culturally relevant images, people, and content so they connect immediately and there's no confusion, no doubt that they matter. And then 4th, we talked about the financial aid. It's just, we need to address every obstacle that people not only know about it, but are getting assistance through the process for financial aid. And the career education opportunities are limitless, but we need to increase the awareness for Black and African-American community and the role that education plays in preparing students for good jobs, good careers, and that don't necessarily require a 4-year degree. And then I think we want to make sure that we increase the number of Black students in California community college that transfer annually from the system to the UC or the state system. This is critical to meet our workforce needs in the future. These recommendations are critical to the success of African-American Black students. We must be intentional, unapologetic, and committed to the long term for real change for African-American students. So we're glad to be a part of this discussion and certainly in the movement ahead of us.
Thank you very much, Cassandra, and also Greg. Your comments today and the recommendations from the California Community College Black and African American Advisory Panel are much needed right now. And we look forward to working with you as relates to implementing those recommendations. There's been also other needs and recommendations that have been developed over the last year through Umoja and also Amen through their work. And so today we also have the need and recommendations that we provided to you today by Dr. Frank Harris from San Diego State University.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this historic convening. I am offering these remarks on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Joseph Wood. Next slide, please. We see this convening as critical to bringing about systemic policy reform. Historically, efforts to improve educational access for minoritized Californians have been mostly compensatory, focusing primarily on programs and initiatives. Now, while these efforts have been undeniably important, policy reforms are needed to close stubborn and persistent equity gaps between Black Californians and their majority peers. This convening is unique in that it brings together key stakeholders and constituency groups that rarely, if ever, come together to strategize and engage in a collective sense-making that is necessary and urgently needed to come up with novel policy solutions to improve post-secondary education access and success for Black Californians. We're at a critical time in our state's history. We have a governor who recognizes the important role that community colleges play in the social and economic well-being of our state. We have a state chancellor who has given us a bold and transparent vision for success that prioritizes equity. And we have a critical mass of community college educators who have come to understand that equity-mindedness and institutional responsibility are the foundations of student success, particularly for students who've been historically underserved in education. Given these factors, we must prioritize the education of Black Californians now, and we must do it with a sense of urgency. COVID-19 has revealed long-standing and deeply rooted social inequities that disproportionately affect Black families, such as access to basic technology, inadequate healthcare systems, mass incarceration, and basic needs insecurities, to name a few. And although these inequities have persisted for decades, crises like COVID-19 have a way of reminding us how much more work we need to do to improve the living conditions of Black Californians. And finally, we all have an opportunity to be on the right side of history. Equity-minded policy reforms today could change the educational and life trajectories of Black Californians for decades to come. Next slide. There are nearly 2.5 million Black Californians, which comprises nearly 6% of our state's population. Nearly 1/3 of Black adults in our states have attended college, but do not have a degree. And we also know that community college is the primary pathway to post-secondary education for Black Californians, and that 72% of Black students who are enrolled in a public post-secondary institution in our state are enrolled at a community college, compared to the 9% and the 3% who are enrolled in a CSU and UC respectively. Now, one of the many reasons why community colleges are so vital to Black Californians is that nearly 2/3 of Black high school graduates in our state are not eligible to be admitted to the UC or the CSU because they have not successfully completed the A through G requirements. Next slide. Black students in community colleges are not reflective of the quote unquote typical college student population. More than half are adult learners, and more than 3/4 are attending part-time due to family, work, and other commitments. And we must also recognize that although our community colleges are some of the most affordable institutions in the country, the majority of Black students find it difficult to pay the cost of attendance, even after tuition and fees are covered. This is due in part to the fact that a critical mass of Black families are exposed to poverty, with more than 1/4 living below the poverty threshold and nearly half earning $20,000 less per year than California's median household income. Next slide. Community colleges receive the lowest amount of funding per FTES in our state. Now, this is not to say that the UCs, CSUs, and our K-12 systems are getting more than they should, or that they should be getting less. The salient point here is this: Black students attend the colleges that receive the least amount of state funding, which tends to have a compounding effect on educational inequity. Next slide. We also need to understand this. Our funding decisions have long-term consequences. It takes the overwhelming majority of Black students more than 6 years to earn a degree, certificate, or transfer from a community college. This quote from a report that was published by the Institute for College Access and Success in 2019 speaks to the consequences of underfunding. And it says this: the status quo is not a workable path to closing racial equity gaps in degree attainment. Spending is directly connected to student success, and schools cannot spend money they don't have. The result, schools serving the higher shares of underrepresented students of color also have the lowest success rates. Next slide. So because of the trends and issues we've discussed thus far, we offer several policy recommendations to improve post-secondary equity and success for all Black Californians. We need to increase Cal Grant to cover the total cost of attendance, which includes room and board, books, transportation, and other expenses that far exceed tuition and fees. We also need to update Cal Grant eligibility requirements to meet the needs of today's college students, most of whom are adult learners and who are enrolled part-time. Next, students should be allowed to use their Cal Grants to attend an out-of-state institution. Now, here's one example of why this is necessary. The California Community Colleges has established transfer partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities that have a proven track record of success in educating Black students. However, there are no HBCUs in California, and many of these institutions are incredibly expensive to attend, which makes it difficult for students who are already experiencing significant financial constraints. And also, Black students do not have equitable access to the CSU or the UC. Now, this is due in part to limitations in enrollment capacity. So we also need to increase enrollment capacity of the CSU and of the UC, as doing so will increase the likelihood that more Black Californians can attend a public university without having to leave the state. Next slide. We need to employ a race-conscious perspective as we make decisions about funding and the allocation of resources. Race consciousness means that we are intentional in recognizing the realities of race for people of color and the ways in which institutional racism shapes educational access, opportunity, and success in both historical and contemporary US contexts. In being race conscious, we should consider adding race as a metric to determine the amount of funding colleges receive by way of the student-centered funding formula and the Student Equity and Achievement Program. We also need to maintain state investments in the Student Equity and Achievement Program, as this program has been essential in providing the resources that colleges need to institutionalize equity. And then we also need to allocate COVID-19 stimulus money with a race-conscious perspective. Last slide. We need to equitize funding in post-secondary education, give the community colleges more funding per FTES than they are currently receiving. But we need to do this without diverting resources away from the CSU, UC, or our K-12 systems. And finally, we need to enact policies that make it easier for students to access state financial aid and eliminate barriers that make it difficult for many Black students to complete the financial aid process. And with that, I want to thank you for allowing me to address you this afternoon. And I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Curry. Thank you.
Dr. Harris, for your remarks today. As we move through this program, one thing we're going to move into is talking about housing and food insecurity of African-American students. It was great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Rab, who's the founder of the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice at Temple University.
Thanks so much, Keith. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. It's such an important time to be addressing these issues. And I don't think that we could really talk about Black student success in America, particularly at the college level, without admitting that students' basic needs are fundamental conditions of learning. We cannot expect students to focus on school if they don't have a safe place to sleep or enough food to eat. And that's why my team at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice was so grateful to the California community colleges for partnering with us on a survey that allowed us to unpack these issues for the California community colleges. That's the data that I'm going to have a chance to speak with you about today. But before I begin with that data, I want to say that I hope you'll look at these data with a lens focused on action. Now is the time to take steps to address these students' needs. And I know that many folks on this town hall have ideas for how to do so. The federal government has allocated CARES funding, which includes emergency aid for living expenses, but there are real risks that it is not allocated equitably. So I hope that as you look at the next numbers, you think about that and consider what we can do together. Next slide. First thing I want to do is make sure we're on the same page about what it means to be food insecure in the United States. A lot of people wonder, why don't we just use the term hungry? Well, frankly, it's because food insecurity is about more than hunger. It's about not having enough money to be able to buy food on a regular basis. When this happens to an individual repeatedly over time, the truth is that some of them get used to it. And so if you ask them, have you been hungry lately? They say no. Other people are ashamed to admit it. So instead, we use the US Department of Agriculture's standard validated instrument, and we ask students the questions listed on the screen. As you can see, they range from things you might think of as not that big a deal, like being worried about the amount of money you have to buy food, to things that I think we could agree are a very big deal. Cutting the size of your meals or skipping meals, running out of food because you don't have enough money, losing weight. The truth is that's not a great measure because you can also gain weight when you don't have enough money to buy healthy food. And even the deepest experience, which is going a day or even as many as 3 or more days in the last 30 days without enough food. These kinds of questions must be asked of all college students and the results taken seriously if they're to have a real shot at graduating. Next slide. Housing insecurity and homelessness must also be attended to. You have a little more conversation about this in California than the rest of us, but the truth is it's still not getting enough attention. Many people are, for example, focused right now on moratoriums on evictions, but we know that's not going to last. Students who have trouble paying their rent on time or at all may be at risk of eviction and eventual homelessness. People who are not paying their utility bills. Well, some of them are going to have a hard time right now getting enough internet access or having consistent access so they can do their schoolwork. People living in overcrowded conditions or doubled up, these are folks who are going to struggle with all kinds of things, including focusing and doing online learning. People who are homeless, it goes beyond what you see on the street. It includes people who are couch surfing. It includes people who sleep in their cars. These definitions are used by the US Department of Education. Just as in their K-12 schools, they need to be used in the community colleges and the rest of higher education as well. We measure these things as they affect students over the last 12 months, because even one incidence of housing insecurity or one night experiencing homelessness has a lasting educational impact. And we shouldn't pretend that it's anything short of real lived trauma. Next slide. Now, we have fielded this validated instrument all over the country. It's become a little bit easier lately, but I want to admit that many institutions still don't give us access to students so that we can assess these things. In California, however, the University of California system and the Cal State system did more assessment of this before the California community colleges did. And we were glad to have the opportunity to therefore expand this to where, frankly, I think it's most needed at the California community colleges. Nonetheless, I want to note that the Cal Grant, for example, flows to many not-for-profit and for-profit institutions. And those students rarely have their basic needs assessed. Similarly, I think many on this town hall are concerned with students at HBCUs. Please note that very few HBCUs have fielded systematic surveys to assess their students' basic needs. While it might be easier to not raise these issues or not talk about them, it's hard to raise money to actually help students or target support services if you don't collect that data. So that is certainly one of our hopes of what's going to come in the next 6 months. Next slide. Now, what you can see on your screen, hopefully, is the range of the food insecurity, housing insecurity, and homelessness rates that we have found around the country. I'm going to show you California data next, and I'm going to show you the data focused specifically on African Americans after that. But I wanted you to get a sense of the magnitude, because the fact is, this is a major problem. A lot of people talk about the remedial education prevalence rates and express a lot of concern and lean in hard to addressing those. But just as many students are affected by basic needs insecurity, and yet it gets less attention. Next slide. In fact, if we look across students and we ask how many of them were completely secure in their basic needs over the last year, didn't experience food insecurity, didn't experience housing insecurity, slept in a safe, stable place every night, we find that only 38% of the nation's community college students can say all of that's true for them. That means the vast majority of students from all backgrounds need their basic needs supports. Next slide. Now, let's talk about that California survey. It happened in the fall of 2018, clearly before the pandemic, and it wasn't at all of the colleges in the California community college system, but it was a lot of them. We surveyed and got responses from over 40,000 students at 57 of the institutions. We found that 50% of respondents were food insecure in the prior 30 days, 60% were housing insecure in the last year, and 19% had experienced homelessness. And that was before the pandemic. We can only imagine how much those numbers might have increased now. And the Hope Center is pleased that we will be working with the Chancellor's office to field a survey very soon to assess changes in those rates. Next slide. I want to look at the disparities, and I think they need to be put into context. We do consider 11 different racial ethnic categories in all of our work, and this is the California data disaggregated by race ethnicity. I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone here that African Americans were far more likely than white non-Hispanic students to face food insecurity, to the tune of 62% of them not getting enough to eat in the last 30 days. And this survey was fielded in October, which means that these students were in school, taking on debt, many of them trying to go to class, but didn't have enough to eat. Next slide. Same thing is true for housing insecurity. You can see the disaggregated data show that 73% of African-American students in the California community colleges that we surveyed exhibited housing insecurity in the last 12 months. In comparison, the non-Hispanic white students, the rate was 59%. My last slide. Homelessness. This is really where I want to leave you. 31% of African-American students in the California community colleges surveyed, 31% had experienced homelessness in the last year. Now, for white students, it was 21%. For Hispanic or Latinx students, it was 17%, and for Native American students, 32%. There is no level at which these rates could be acceptable to anyone, but we have to be very clear about the disproportionate impact of basic needs insecurity on Black student success. We have many opportunities to address this. Some of the leaders on this call are doing so, including Keith at Compton College and Pam Lester in San Diego. But we need far more attention and public demand that students be treated as humans first, and that this is a racial equity issue. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, Sarah, for being here as well. It's a great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. soon-to-be Dr. Herbert English, Vice President Student Services at West Hills College, Coalinga, and board member of MEN. He will be running the session as relates to our student speakers today. Mr. English.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curry. It is my pleasure to work with two of our VIPs in the California Community College, which is our students. We have Stacy and we have David, and I'm going to allow them to just briefly tell their story of coming to the community college. Stacy?
Hi, I'm Stacy Gershon, and I am currently attending American River Community College in Sacramento, California. I came to American River College a little over 5 years ago. I was homeless. I was surviving a severely domestic violence relationship of a marriage of over 20 years that I walked away from. I was also working through PTSD and a lot of learning disabilities. Needless to say, I had a lot of trouble. And being a returning student at the age of 50 at that time, I had no idea what an uphill battle that I would have to do in getting my education. Anyway, because of the Umoja program and being introduced to the Umoja program, the food vouchers, the book vouchers, the food cards, the tutoring services, being able to see teachers of color to help me meet my full potential, the amazing staff that I had have the support of in that program has really helped me to navigate through the adversities that I've experienced since I've been in school, and I still continue to experience now that this COVID-19 has placed. It really helped me to become an overcomer, and the staff of Umoja just speaks life, and helping me to navigate through these very difficult times. And so I'm currently in the Human Services program at ARC. And like I said earlier, I was homeless, and I'm now actually I'm gainfully employed at the college that I attend as a custodian, and I work graveyards, and I'm very grateful for that. Unfortunately, since this COVID virus has come up, I've had to take in my family members who've lost their jobs, my adult children and my grandchildren. And so I'm having to learn and be forced to go to school online when I have learning disabilities has been extremely a struggle. However, because of the Umoja program and the support that I've received emotionally and mentally, and the mental health services that I've received to continue going through what I'm going through, has been extremely helpful. Today, as I stated earlier, I'm gainfully employed as a custodian there. I'm in a human services program. I expect to graduate spring of 2021. And for people who are over 50, there is life. After 50, we can still become a part of the solution. And I just am honored to be representative of this program, Umoja, and I'm hoping that somehow anyone can receive the help that I've been given, and I hope we can continue to receive. It really helped me to get a second chance on a first-class life. Today, I have an attitude of gratitude. In spite of the difficulties that I'm having to face on a daily basis, I'm going to continue to trust this process and hope that this too will pass. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much, Stacy. David?
All right, there we go. My name is David Perez. I'm from Oakland, California. I graduated from Victor Valley Community College in Victorville. I'm currently attending the University of California, Santa Barbara as a fourth-year cultural psych major. I'm the treasurer of the Society for Undergraduate Psychologists, and I'm a board member for the AS Food Bank. I got here by way of a long, hard road. I'm one of three sons born to two addicts who gave more attention to their addictions than they did to their children. And it caused me to become a child with a lot of insecurities that grew into an adult with just as many insecurities, plus a whole lot of responsibilities. One of which is my little girl. She just turned 18, so she's not so little anymore. But so something had to change in my life. I knew that I didn't want to continue the negative, unsupportive lifestyle that had been handed down to me. I always wanted something better for my life, and then now for my daughter's life. I didn't know how I was going to do that. And with no support, I didn't even know if that was something that I could do. All that changed when one of my brothers had basically called and asked if I would move down. Just a little change in life. I started community college at the time, and one of my motivators was take some classes, get a check, and it was going to be easy. But when I finally got to community college, I started to see people taking an interest in my life and in my future, and it basically changed the way that I've seen my life and the direction of my future. So right away, I became an advocate for my own change. I ended up taking on a job on campus, which introduced me not only just to the students, but also the staff and faculty. I was basically everywhere on campus: career center, counseling office, bookstore, DSP, and then finally student equity and success. It was at that time where I was approached by an admin mentor and asked if I would be interested in becoming a mentee. I attended my first admin mentee conference in 2017, which basically gave me this amazing amount of confidence. And then in 2018, I became Victor Valley College's ASB president, and I was a student trustee on the board of trustees. That same year, I got accepted to 9 of the 12 Cal States and universities that I applied for. After months of deliberating and going back and forth and driving the people around me crazy, I settled on UCSB. It's still difficult for me being a first-gen student. I struggle every day with insecurities, but from my child traumas. But I have a great support system behind me now with the men and with a lot of the staff members that I still keep in contact with from the community college. And they care and they've invested in me and my future. And I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to be here today to speak to everyone.
Thank you so much, Stacy and David. Just one more question. If there is anything you can change about your experience at the community college, just one thing, what would it be?
Go ahead, Stacy. Do you want to go first?
Okay. Wow, one thing. So how can I put these top 3 things into one thing? I would say financial aid is extremely hard to navigate through, especially as a returning student. Also, the availability and greater transparency with student jobs on campus. Also, the DSPS student additional services, and being able to have mental health services for us, for our students, especially of color. Having a therapist of color on campus that I can identify with and I don't have to explain things to, and they give me solutions to help me navigate through this process. I don't have the words. I'm just extremely grateful for those services, and I don't have to pay for them. It's extremely helpful. So that's what I would, looking back on, I would hope we could continue to have.
Stacy, thank you so much. And last but not least, David.
You know what? Looking back in the time that I was in community college, I think that one thing that I would change, or I'd like to see change, is the community college addressing the fact that minority communities are real interdependent, and they're not taught to be independent. They're not taught to ask for the things that they need. They're taught to just be grateful for what they have. And it would be nice for the colleges who know that these community college members are going to start matriculating into universities, where universities basically promote independence, that would start teaching minority community college students that they can ask for these services that colleges offer, because they're not well advertised on campus. That I think that would be a huge help. A lot of these white collar neighborhood students are taught how to be independent, and they're given opportunities to be independent and express themselves. But we all know that that's not how all schools are in all communities. So I think that would be something that I'd like to see change.
Well, Stacy and David, I truly appreciate you taking the time today. In my eyes and in everyone's eyes, you are the reason that we're here today, and you guys are very important people in the community college. You are our VIPs. Thank you, Dr. Curry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. English. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speakers. We have Dr. Sean Harper from University of Southern California and also Dr. Tyrone Howard from UCLA.
Thank you. Okay, there we are. We're unmuted. Great, thanks. I would like to start by thanking all of you who have gathered for this really important conversation concerning African American students here in California. I would especially like to thank President Keith Curry for organizing us and for really putting together what I think is a tremendous cast of experts who possess deep passion, commitment, and expertise on these issues. Professor Howard.
I'd like to also chime in and echo those words, Dr. Harper. I want to thank Dr. Curry for his just unrelenting leadership on making sure that we keep the spotlight and focus on our most vulnerable populations. I also want to say thank you to all the attendees who have been gracious with their time and expertise and insight and wisdom on this important topic. So I'm looking forward to how we move these words into action to help African-American students across the state of California.
Great. So Professor Howard and I are doing this together, frankly, because we have been in frequent conversation with each other. Most of his work focuses on Black students in K-12 schools and districts, and most of mine focuses on higher education. So we thought that together we might be able to, really help raise national consciousness and certainly consciousness here in California about the specific needs of African-American students all throughout the educational pipeline. Can we advance to the next slide? All right, so I want to start here in the higher education context and just say that we at the USC Race and Equity Center spend much of our time studying things like campus racial climate, the experiences of students of color, but we also document through our research racial disproportionality and the disparate impact of policies and practices on students of color broadly. And most of our work has been focused on documenting the disparate impact of various situations on African Americans, be it the disproportionality in school suspension and expulsion in K-12 settings, as well as disproportionality in graduation rates and things like that in post-secondary education. But I want to help us bring together what journalists have helped us in recent weeks to understand to be the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the health outcomes of African Americans here in California and all across the country. As we know, African Americans have been dying from the coronavirus at disproportionately higher rates. So that inevitably poses a serious threat to African American student success in higher education, especially in community colleges. I think the point that I'm making here is that if Black family members and members of Black communities are dying from the virus at disproportionately higher rates, that for sure is going to impact concentration, motivation. It certainly is going to lead to depression for students who are, again, facing, the mortality at disproportionately higher rates. So we got to think about that as we move forward with supporting student success. Yes, it is about providing for basic needs, absolutely, but it also has to be about providing for the emotional and psychological needs and the trauma, the residual trauma that Black students will certainly bring back to campuses with them and that they're actually, frankly, facing right now as people are dying at disproportionately higher rates. Next point here is around poverty, food insecurity, and housing insecurity. I really appreciate the brilliance of Sarah Gold-Robb. I thought that her data were especially depressing, but yet, really, really helpful, as she always is. So, she's helped us to understand that, Black students before COVID-19 were experiencing housing and food insecurity at disproportionately higher rates. So we have to think about now how the current circumstances have exacerbated those inequities, right? On a campus like mine, where we provided lots of resources for students to return home, underfunded community colleges were not able to offer those same kinds of resources and that same level of resourcing to help students return to home. But it also presupposes that students actually have a home to return to. Our center has been doing tremendous work with the Los Angeles Unified School District, which was able, I think, to really move toward action in some really fast ways to get devices to students, to get broadband, high-speed internet access, and so on. But again, that supposes that students actually have homes to return to. So we got to think about students experiencing homelessness in general, but again, think about those numbers that Sarah provided to us that really show us that it is African-American students, most especially, who are experiencing housing and food insecurity. Next point here is around unemployment. I really appreciated that Stacy, one of the two student speakers from whom we just heard, talked about having a job on campus. That's really important, right? What we do know from the recession in 2008 and from other moments of economic instability is that there are particular jobs that will be first on the chopping block, where we will see a significant reduction in hours. For example, food service workers, custodial workers, groundskeepers, and so on. Sometimes on some campuses, students like Stacy occupy those roles. So we have to think about, the impact that, a reduction in hours and furloughs and so on will have, not just on full-time and part-time workers, but will also have on student workers. Furthermore, as we're thinking about what college students are grappling with right now, we know from J. Luke Wood's research and Frank Harris's research that community college students are likely to work off-campus jobs, and they're likely to work jobs for more than 20 hours a week. Well, many of the places where they work are closed right now due to COVID-19. So, those students are struggling with, the income that they needed to support themselves and their family members, in those hourly jobs that are no longer open right now. So again, that's the thing that we have to think about, and think about, again, the disproportionality of African Americans and Latinx students who work those kinds of jobs that are, just frankly closed right now. Two more points here. The fourth is around culturally unresponsive teaching practices and culturally irrelevant curricula. Again, these were problems that existed way before COVID-19. But as many faculty members like me had to abruptly move our courses online with no prior training in online instruction, I think that it makes bad teaching even worse, right? It makes bad teaching worse for all of the students who are having to suffer through, sitting in virtual classrooms taught by adjuncts and full-time faculty members who were just frankly unprepared for this moment. But it is exacerbated for students of color and for African-American students. Like, suddenly the curriculum didn't suddenly become culturally more inclusive and responsive to those communities. So it made a bad thing even worse for students. I appreciated that Stacy talked so extensively about Moja and the important role that that particular resource plays in her college experience. For many of the students whom we study in our campus racial climate research at community colleges and four-year colleges and universities, they tell us that it's the programs like Moja, it is the Black Student Union, It is the Ethnic Cultural Center, the Black Cultural Center, the Multicultural Affairs Office that provides them a place for reprieve from, sitting in courses all day long where they were minoritized, underrepresented, erased from the curriculum, and so on. Well, those places don't exist right now, as the workers in those cultural centers and so on are having, like me, to work from home. So what I'm saying is that, normally a student like Stacy would go to Umoja for cultural affirmation, cultural validation, and so on. She doesn't have a place like that to go to right now. And there are so many other students of color and Black students particularly who don't have a Black student union to go to for, again, the kind of validation and relief. The last point that I want to make here is that we ought not forget about the disproportionate representation of Black people among those who are incarcerated and justice involved. And we ought to think about what we now know from the criminal justice researchers and from journalists who've helped raise our consciousness about this in recent weeks, that the coronavirus outbreaks in prisons is just absolutely, totally beyond alarming. Who are the prisoners? Disproportionately, they're Black and brown, and overwhelmingly, they're African Americans. And, if we think about, higher education for incarcerated persons, it could be that those persons are now at greater risk of dying from the virus. Furthermore, those who were formerly incarcerated who would go to a community center that partnered with a community college to offer post-secondary opportunity, those centers are not places that people can go to right now, given the stay-at-home orders. I really appreciated that Chancellor Oakley said so squarely to each of us that African Americans in the post-COVID-19 recovery efforts ought to be first in line. I think that's absolutely right, given that we have been first in line for the disproportionality and the disproportionate impact that the virus has had on our communities. Next week, under Keith Curry's great leadership, he's made time for Professor Tyrone Howard and I to come back together to talk about some solutions to these problems that we're laying out. But at this time, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Professor Howard, to talk about some of the K-12 issues.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. I want to really build off of what so many of the other presenters have highlighted, because this is something that we have to continue to put a spotlight on in terms of looking at the pipeline, not just K-12, but really K-20. And part of the challenges that we continue to see at the community college level are not a byproduct of a broken system at the community college level. They're really a byproduct of a broken system at the K-12 level and a lack of investment in public education for our most neediest students across the state of California, of which Black students are primarily amongst them. So I want to touch upon 4 key issues that we must remain steadfast in our support as we think about this pandemic that we're dealing with. As so many of the other presenters have eloquently articulated, the impact of COVID-19 has only served as a spotlight to shine what we already knew existed: widespread racial inequality that exists in the state of California. It has put it on full display. It has only shown the degrees to which we continue to not serve some of our students in the way that they deserve. We know that for Black students in the K-12 system, that these effects are going to be technological, because we continue to see that large numbers of Black students across states still do not have access to internet, still do not have access to computers and laptops that are supposedly now essential for their learning. We know that the COVID-19 impact is also going to have some serious academic ramifications. If students are not able to log in, if they're not connected with their teachers, if they're not being sought out by their schools, what we know is already a gap between the academic outcomes for Black students and their peers will only widen. And we have to begin to put pressure to ensure that the state and counties and cities and districts are not forgetting about Black students in this pandemic. We also know, as Professor Harper just articulated, that the social and emotional fallout is going to be crucial for all students, but Black students in particular, given the high rates that we see Black people are dying from COVID. And I want us to be clear, these numbers that we're seeing are lives. These lives are people who have had a profound impact on the day-to-day lives of young people. These are not just mere numbers. These are mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers, aunts and uncles, that young people who are in schools are still reeling from the loss of. So we cannot forget the fact that young people are not only grieving now because of the loss of loved ones, but they will continue to grieve even when we resume back to whatever normalcy will look like when it happens. And we also must be clear that these consequences are not only going to have technological, academic, social, and emotional, but they will be financial. As so many of the presenters have stated here, is that we know that African Americans are losing jobs at rates that no other group are losing jobs. Unemployment rates for African Americans high before COVID-19 will only be even higher. So we have to understand the multi-pronged effect this is going to continue to have on African Americans in terms of their K-12 preferences, K-12 preparation, and will undoubtedly have an impact on their transition to post-secondary education. The second piece I want us to continue to spotlight is the ongoing link between K-12 and higher education. I want to applaud Dr. Keith Curry because he has always been steadfast in making sure that we do what we can to invest in K-12 to ensure that we're giving every opportunity for African-American students to come to colleges prepared and ready. We know for years, for example, that many more of our more affluent communities have always used dual enrollment as a way to give their students an advantage and a leg up so that when they came to the community college, sometimes they were already a year of college completed in. We already know that these dual enrollment programs have already given our more affluent communities an opportunity to come to universities already 2 years in. Dr. Keith Curry's leadership has been pivotal in making sure that the partnerships with the Compton Unified School District, which I'm a proud product of, that the Paramount School District, that the Linwood School District are being afforded those same opportunities that their more affluent peers have been given. We must fortify the link between K-12 and higher education. We know that Black students, as Dr. Harris so effectively articulated, are coming through K-12 systems not qualified, not because of their doing, but because of lack of opportunity and access and resources to ensure that they are able to be successful at every level possible to pursue their post-secondary education pathways. And third, I so appreciate the number of folks who have talked about the intentionality upon which we must focus on Black students in this conversation. I am all for making sure that we have multicultural and multi-ethnic coalitions. I think they're important and they have their place, but I think it's also okay to place a spotlight on Black students. The data that we have done at our center and the Pritzker Center and the UCLA Black Male Institute, in conjunction with the Center for Transformation Schools with my colleague Pedro Noguera, has shown that when Black students are in situations where we talk about structural disadvantage, the rates of foster youth are higher, the rates of homelessness are higher, the rates of displacement from employment are higher. It is obvious on so many levels that this is a byproduct of structural disadvantage, of racism. So I appreciate once again, Dr. Frank Harris saying that there needed to be a race-conscious set of policies, a race-conscious set of practices, a race-conscious set of interventions that are very intentional and unapologetic about the need to advocate, support, and continue to see the needs of Black students being placed at the forefront of our analysis of how we recover from COVID-19. And then finally, I think it's imperative, and I say this often because we are so fixated at times on what is not happening, what is wrong with our communities, but I want to make sure that our work continues to exemplify the cases of Black excellence, the amazing Black resilience that we are seeing from children and families across this entire state, the manner in which we see educators and counselors and teachers being beyond available for their students. We must spotlight where we are seeing some inroads. I've seen some amazing work happening in the Lancaster School District. Dr. Michelle Bowers has been a true hero and a champion, ensuring that her students are getting the kinds of supports and basic needs that they have. It is so important that we show that even in the face of adversity, even in the face of racism, in the face of exclusion and what seems to be dire times, that there's still a host of heroes and sheroes who are out there fighting for our children, defending our children, giving their time, their talent, and their tender, their resources to ensure that Black children are not forgotten. I want to say thank you to all the individuals who've been a part of this conversation. We cannot let this just be lots of talk and full of and not any action. So I applaud again, Dr. Keith Curry, for your leadership and for everyone for making sure that we do not lose sight of the needs of Black students in this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Howard and Dr. Harper. Now we want to move into our question and answer portion of today's meeting. And I would like to introduce Dr. Pam Luster, president of San Diego Mesa College, and also an Equity Avenger, to coordinate the questions and answer period.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Keith. And we have had well over 100 questions that have been posed. And I want to thank my friends from Ed Trust West and the campaign for culling together some really remarkable and prioritized questions. The first we're going to direct to Dr. Wood and Dr. Harris. Jerry Santos is asking, although several $1 million have been given to community colleges, the students of color success rates in many cases have declined. Do you know if there are any models that have actually moved the needle towards increasing success rates for African American students? If so, how are their strategies implemented and who on their campuses spearheaded the success efforts?
Thank you, Dr. Luster, and thank you to the colleague who asked the question. I'm sorry I missed the name, but I think we have to look at success rates in an equity-minded and broad perspective. So we know that things like grade point average, transfer rates, attainment rates, that those are rates that tend to take a long time to change. And so, but we've seen at least in the California community colleges, they've been huge investments over the past 4 or 5 years. But we're talking about inequities that have been around for well over a decade. And so I think it takes time for certain outcomes for us to demonstrate measurable change and measurable success. And I also think it's important that we're not just looking exclusively at quantitative data, that we're also looking at qualitative data. We're asking students about the impact of some of these efforts. I think our students today, David and Stacy, did a great job of articulating the ways in which colleges have done some important things to impact their success that might not exactly show up in an immediate success rate or a transfer rate or so forth. And then in terms of model programs and institutions, there are quite a few. I think we have the president of 2 of those institutions here, Dr. Luster and Dr. Curry. I would consider exemplars as it relates to community colleges that have done a great job of institutionalizing equity and making a real significant difference in the lives and success of students.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Our next question could go to Dr. Howard and Dr. Harper, which is, Steve Baisa asks, California has stressed equity as a priority, and yet when systemic change is required to address Black student success, many keep pushing the focus on low income and first gen students. How can we go beyond the intersectional dynamics to put a focus on reforms and structural change to transform Black student success? And along those lines, can you share your thoughts on adding race as a metric to determine the amount of funding colleges receive by the way of the student-centered funding formula and student equity funds? It's a mouthful, but I have faith in both of you.
Well, I'll start off, Dr. Luster. Number one, I think that I so appreciate the question because it speaks to the heart of one of our biggest challenges. And that is that we have, even as diverse as we are racially as a state in California, we have not been willing to tackle honestly and in a sustained and robust and honest way the role that race and racism continues to play in the day-to-day lives of all of our citizens. We have not. As progressive as we as we present to be, we still have fallen short in being very intentional around that. And I think part of what we are arguing for in our report, Beyond the Schoolhouse, which we put out last year, is that there needed to be an intentional and sustained set of outcomes and recommendations on Black education. Plain and simple. You look at all the data, you look at all the metrics, you look at all the outcomes, and it continues to show that Black students are always on the outside looking in, continue to receive less funding per pupil, continue to be in classrooms with unqualified teachers, continue to be in schools that are oftentimes underfunded and under-resourced. So at some point in time when we are really intentional about this, I think we'll have race-conscious policies that do spotlight and intentionalize the needs of Black students.
Yeah, I'll just simply underscore the important points that Tyrone just made. It is very clear that when we look at just about every statistical metric of educational progress, performance, and attainment, Black students and Native American students are almost always at the very bottom. That would then suggest to us that no sort of one size fits all a rising tide lifts all boats approach is going to work in addressing the specific needs of African American students here in California or elsewhere. The data make very clear to us where the challenges, needs, and opportunities are. And I do want to go back and connect this to COVID-19. Again, given what we know to be the enormous health disparities and the disproportionate impact of the virus on African American communities, it's going to be African American students who are going to be most traumatized and most in need of resources in the aftermath, in the recovery period. We make very clear at the USC Race and Equity Center that we don't have to take a zero-sum approach to racial equity. A focus on Black students doesn't have to be at the expense of Latinx students, but there are very specific needs, challenges, and issues that confront Black students that are different from the specific issues confronting Pacific Islander students, Asian American students, Native American, and Latinx students. So we got to get much more responsible. I think it is irresponsible at this point to continue on with a raceless agenda and with an agenda that doesn't respond to the specific needs of specific racial groups.
Thank you to both of you for that. We have a question for our legislators, for Senator Bradford, Assemblymember Kumlager. Dr. Ashanti Hands asks, how will you and other allied legislators support Cal Grant reform in the face of significant budget challenges?
Oh, hello, this is Senator Bradford. One more time, I'm sorry, my phone was muted.
That is no problem. Dr. Hands is asking, how will you and other allied legislators support Cal Grant reform in the face of budget challenges?
That's a good question, and it's going to be tough. And we've been talking about Cal Grant reform in state legislature for a number of years, making sure that those dollars reach those communities that need it the most, as much of this discussion has been centered around African American students. We're going to, through the Black Caucus, going to continue to make our voices heard and raising those concerns, as we had, as I stated, a very productive conversation with the governor on Monday. He's very supportive of many of those issues that we raised. Dr. Shirley Weber, who is the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, a former professor at my alma mater, San Diego State, is a clear and clarion voice on what we need to do in that area. So we're going to continue to raise that issue and make sure our voices are heard, and make sure we find some way of bringing equity to the table. Hello.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for that. We are all behind you on that. You let us know how we can help. We are fans. This is for Dr. Goldrick-Rab, or our college presidents. How can we partner with community organizations to address basic needs? Addressing food and housing insecurities can be a challenge, especially in these times where we're going to see budget reductions. What role can the state play in increasing funding to community colleges in these areas?
Well, I'll take the first stab. Partnering with community organizations and particularly human service agencies is absolutely critical. Your local public housing authority should be at the table. Your local food bank should be at the table, as well as local advocates who can, for example, assist you in connecting students to public benefits programs. You know, a lot of folks feel like they're being asked to do more with less, and it's true. I mean, I think there's no way around this. The funding of California community colleges is grossly inadequate. And I don't think that we can disconnect that from the disproportional representation of African Americans in the community colleges. But in the meantime, unfortunately, the need continues and the work goes on. And so partnerships are one of the best ways to make that happen. I do refer you all to the Hope Center's website, where under resources, we have a laundry list of reports helping you look at examples from other institutions.
Thank you. Dr. Curry, did you want to answer any of that at all?
Yeah, I think it's important in light of COVID-19 to establish partnership with local businesses. One of the things that I'm very adamant about is regards to food insecurity of our students during this time. And we have established a partnership with every table in this community.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Directed to all of our panelists, how can colleges maximize the impact of the federal CARES funds that are coming for student aid specifically for our Black students? And that was directed to any panelist.
Well, this is Cassandra Jennings, and I'll try to answer that in conjunction with the question earlier. Is I think partnerships in particular with small businesses and nonprofit organizations in the community is important. We have seen here in Sacramento, working even with our community colleges, we've been able to support the students at the community college with support services, which would include rent relief, paying utilities, helping them find those things that would support them. So I think on the same way with the CARES is that to the extent the local entities, the nonprofits and the businesses are able to take advantage of it, they should be partnering with the colleges to really make sure that it's getting to the people that need it. And I will say that our partnership with Sac City College with the Community Health Workers Program has really proved where the college is doing their thing with a certificated program, we're able to support those students with a lot of resources to help them be successful.
Thank you. Any of our other panelists want to respond to that?
I'll take it. You know, I have to say it's been challenging to contain my outrage at the inequitable distribution of CARES funding. I think that it's really important right now for people to speak up and to speak out about the persistent use of FTE for distribution mechanism for the CARES funding rather than headcount. There are a disproportionate number of African Americans who attend college part-time, and each one of them deserves an advisor and support services. The focus on FTE means that they don't get the support that they need. The stimulus dollars and the programs are not done. So there will be more stimulus legislation. And I think going and pushing on that issue and focusing everyone on the importance of using headcount rather than FTE is critical.
This is Senator Bradford. Can you hear me?
Yes.
On this current round that just went out, we have to commend the Congressional Black Caucus because they inserted language to make sure that this money is more targeted than that first round. Again, the first round of money went to major corporations that did not need this money. So it's imperative that we now have the data to not only drill it down to those Black businesses, but those communities in need. And I think that money will then be directed to community colleges and our CSU and our US, but it has to be targeted to those communities and those individuals. And that's part of the data that the governor's compiling right now. But again, the Congressional Black Caucus through Karen Bass was very vocal on making sure that we had a more targeted approach in the first round of money. So I think through those efforts and similar efforts with the state legislative Black Caucus, we will get a better result.
Thank you so much, Senator Bradford. We really appreciate this. And we're going to end this here, and I believe this will kick it off nicely back to Dr. Curry. A lot of folks are asking about the work that speakers are actively engaged in, and I know that there are next steps that are going to roll out next week where you're going to be able to announce some of that. So I'm going to let that question sit until you have those exciting announcements and turn it back over to you. And again, we thank everyone for posing these wonderful questions and to our panelists for answering them on the fly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luster. I do right now have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Edward Bush, member of AMEN and also the president of Casumas River College, who will provide final remarks and also provide you with information about the African American Student Success Week, which is scheduled for next week. Dr. Bush.
Thank you, Dr. Curry, and an excellent job. Join me in a virtual applause to all the speakers today for their informative and impactful presentations. In addition, thank you to our students for sharing powerful stories. On behalf of the Planning Committee, we extend our appreciation to all 1,000 plus of you today who answered the call to join this historic town hall. We'll acknowledge you for your participation and engagement. In many respects, today served as a virtual courtroom. Testimony provided by expert witnesses clearly demonstrates that beyond a reasonable doubt, there has been a miscarriage of justice in how we have traditionally viewed success or the lack thereof for African-American students. Many have perpetuated a blaming the victim phenomenon, where directly or indirectly, we have looked at African-American students as the thing that needed to be fixed. African-American students have been falsely accused, along with their families, cultures, and communities, as the reason for their lack of success. In addition, we have passed judgment against the institutions that serve them as being incompetent and unresponsive in meeting the needs of African-American students. The evidence proved today that African-American students and the institutions that serve them have been suffering for years of economic neglect. Based on the data that was presented today, it is clear that if we want to track the path from student failure to student success, all we have to do is follow the money. Simply put, under-resourced students plus under-resourced institutions equals underperforming students. Conversely, higher resource students plus higher resource institutions equals higher performing students. With 72% of African-American students enrolled in the California community colleges, in comparison to 9% enrollment in the CSU and 3% enrollment in the University of California, we have a separate and unequal public post-secondary system. As the attorney delivering the closing remarks today, defending African-American students, I ask you, the jury, to find African-American students not guilty and acquit them on all counts. All counts of blaming them for their own lack of success. Not guilty of not being prepared for college, not guilty of being accused for not being motivated, not guilty of lacking social capital, and finally, not guilty on the charge of not caring about their education. Since we have determined African-American students are not guilty, then who is the responsible party? Who should be charged guilty with the heinous crime of not providing adequate and proportional resources? I submit that any one of us who has not challenged the status quo, any one of you who has only pushed for slight reform and compensatory programs that reinforce deficit models, anyone who believes that the system is too big, too entrenched, too complex, too powerful, and too daunting to change, and anyone who's failed to reimagine and re-envision a new system where all students are given equitable opportunities to be successful. Those are the true guilty parties. Today, we have the opportunity to begin the process of setting the record straight and to restore justice. We have a chance to improve this system and set a new course in the history of California's African-American community college students by working to implement the recommendations highlighted today. This work is just beginning. We are sending a letter to all legislators with our recommendations. And beginning from April 27th through May 1st, we have African-American Student Success Week, where you would have the opportunity to delve deeper into the recommendations and topics discussed today. We encourage all of you on this call to not only attend next week's webinar, but to also join the hashtag Black Student Success movement by spreading the word and insights you learn from being a part of this webinar. We are so glad to be on this journey towards justice with you. This now concludes our African-American Student Town Hall. The defense rests its case. Enjoy the rest of your day.